It is Wednesday, November 15th, 2017 at 1 o'clock Eastern Time, and this is Admissions Live. I'm your host, Adam Castro, and on today's live broadcast, we are exploring the ever-changing world of international recruitment and strategy with CEO and founder of Terminal4, Piero Tintori. Admissions Live is part of the Higher Ed Live network. Our episodes offer you direct access to the best and brightest minds in education. Be a part of our live broadcast by sharing your knowledge. Participate in today's discussion by tweeting us using hashtag HigherEdLive. All of our episodes are free and easy to access in the video archives at higheredlive.com, or take Higher Ed Live with you on the go by subscribing to the podcast. Are you an enrollment management or admission professional who works with digital content and marketing? If so, mStoner's Digital Marketing for Higher Education online conference is for you. Sessions will address content marketing to recruit students, how to use social listening to identify strategic influencers, search engine optimization, and more. We'll be tweeting out a link shortly to learn more about this conference. Admissions Live is sponsored by NRCCUA, producers of the weekly EduVentures Wake Up Call newsletter. Subscribe to get weekly updates on the most pressing issues and trends in higher education today. Well, I'm really excited to welcome my guest today, Piero Tintori, CEO of Terminal4. I think today's topic is incredibly timely, being the political shifts that are happening both in the U.S. and abroad, but also the importance of international recruitment right now to help U.S. colleges and universities move forward in terms of enrollment and obviously net tuition revenue. So I think some of the things that we're going to talk about, and Piero has some really interesting takes on how colleges and universities should be managing their time, managing their budget as it relates to international marketing and recruitment. I just think it's going to be a really eye-opening discussion. So Piero, welcome to Higher Ed Live.
Thank you very much. We're really delighted to be here.
So I just want to start, if you can just introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about your background, professional experience. If there's any interesting facts, like where you are right now, we'd love to hear them.
Yeah, no, definitely. Thank you so much for inviting me along today. Yeah, I'm actually here in Atlanta at the moment in the salubrious hotel room. I wish, but I was actually at the American Marketing Association Higher Education Conference. So, but I suppose to give you a bit of background, so I'm with Terminal4. And the one-liner is we came from many years ago from a web content management system background. That's what we built. But I suppose where we are now is we built a software platform that helps universities and colleges use smart and modern digital marketing techniques to increase yield and conversion online. So, doing fancy things like personalization, content targeting, and things like that. So, that's sort of where we came from. I suppose where I'm very passionate about higher education. And I suppose where I like to do is work not just with our software, but helping universities think through some of these things. Where we get a lot of exposures, we work with about 200 universities across about 7 countries around the world. And many of those also have sub-campuses in many different locations. We're working on a project at the moment where they've got like a campus in Dubai and they're opening one in China. So where this is becoming very interesting is we're seeing a lot of different, let's call it higher education markets. We're seeing all of their strategies, but we're also seeing how they're trying to compete. And I suppose where it's interesting for today's conversation is I think a lot of universities and colleges don't realize who their competitors are, and they know who their local competitors are. But I think when it comes to international student recruitment, there's a lot of people out there looking to recruit the same students. So yeah, that's sort of my background. I hope that sort of gives you a good overview. But certainly it's an area that I'm really excited about because I think there's a lot of potential. And certainly, as we know, the world's gone through a bit of a crazy time at the moment. So I feel like, it's pretty like surfing potentially it's surfing in big waves. You have to hold on and, stay above the water, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. So what about your background? Really kind of lends itself to the international market. I think, we talk about specializations a lot in higher education, and particularly when it comes to content development, advertising, marketing. Obviously, the international market is very different than the domestic market. So what kind of led you that way, through your career where this has become a little bit of a specialty of yours?
Yeah, well, I mean, something you'd love to say there's a lovely plan, but I think what ended up happening is, as people can probably gather from my accent, started off in Ireland, started working with universities there, and then very quickly started working with universities in the UK. I think I came from sort of a more of a software background, and I suppose what I'm very passionate about is helping digital teams have their web and online channels perform and work harder for them. Because as we know, Adam, it's under-resourcing of teams at the moment, unfortunately, is a trend throughout the world, and that's something that our survey showed as well. So from the UK, one of the big challenges, and I can talk about this in a moment, is that there was drops in funding. Everybody started looking internationally. But then we've also started doing a number of projects, say, in Australia and New Zealand, and we realized that they're actually starting to target the same international students. So, what I'm really interested in is, I love all the tactics around digital marketing, e-commerce techniques. But I suppose what we did with Terminal 4 is we really realized, and 3 years ago, we decided we're only going to work with universities and colleges, firstly, because they're actually nice people to work with. But secondly, is that there was nobody really focusing and helping universities. Like, you could get lots of tools for e-commerce, but very few of them help with the challenges and the nuances of working in higher education. So I find that really exciting, that this is just sort of an area that, it's a niche that we can really put a lot of effort into, but also we see the results, even though it can take a while sometimes to see the results. There's really a lot of opportunities to do cool things to help drive the numbers for people and help them and their teams to work better as well.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And we are going to touch on that, because I thought we had a discussion earlier before we went live and about this competition and everything, but we're going to get to that in a second. But I have a very loaded question for you.
Right.
Brace yourself. It's vague, but I think it's important to kind of set the stage. So obviously, there's been a lot of unrest, turmoil, volatility, whatever you want to say, in the political climate. So we have Donald Trump's presidency, we have Brexit, we have an increase in terrorism, and in some cases, particularly in the news that's being reported on. So how have all these things that have happened really in the last 18 months affected the international recruitment landscape, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think there's really two parts to this. I think there's the perception and then there's reality, right? So I'll talk about reality first, right? I think there's definitely issues with, say, in some countries, visas, and certainly in our survey, the majority of people saw that visa availability is having a big impact on and will have a big impact on student recruitment. That's pretty obvious if the students can't come in. So you have, say, situations, forgetting about, say, the major turmoil, but you have, say, situations like in the UK where the equivalent of Homeland Security, universities used to be able to sort of self-certify students for the visa process. Now, I'm sort of dumbing it down, but basically universities could say, look, automatically these students are fine. Can we have the visas? Thank you very much. Now, there was some issues with how they were managing that process, probably just in terms of governance. So then some universities were actually blocked from being able to do that, and that's had an impact on them. So I think the other reality is that, like, in some countries, it's getting harder to yourselves, like certain restrictions on certain countries and so on, and delayed bureaucracy. So it mightn't be a lack of availability of visas, but it could be just that the process is taking a long time. So there's obvious actual things that are happening. I think the bigger issue, though, is perception. And I think I like the phrase that, perception actually then becomes reality because the impact is the same. The problem with, what we're seeing is that there's students from various countries are seeing that I think there's this whole thing of, like, feeling welcome is very important. And I think certainly that's actually having quite a big impact. And I think we've seen this in a couple of countries where, international students going, well, you know what, with all this press and all this news, I don't know if I would feel welcome going to that particular country. So we've even seen some universities, particularly in England, actually running social media campaigns and to really show that actually you're very welcome. And reality, it is a perception, like, but unfortunately, it's a very, very strong perception. So what we're seeing in some data out there, in say things like the International Student Survey, is that people are saying, okay, well, I don't feel welcome, or I wouldn't feel welcome going to those certain particular countries. So then other countries are using that as a competitive advantage to say, hey, have you thought about, for example, like we've seen Canadian universities use this tactic. We've seen to a lesser extent in Ireland, but even German universities who wouldn't have a huge inbound international student flow. So I think there's two sides to it. There's the sort of perception of being welcome, and then secondly, there's the sort of the challenges around the visa stuff. I can only see that getting tougher. If Brexit goes ahead, we won't get into the conversation of will it ever happen. I do have a bet on with a co-worker as to whether it will happen or not. But I think in the meantime, the perception is having a massive impact on where people are interested in traveling.
No, and I think that's right. And I think we're seeing that too on campuses in the US. I mean, I know of colleagues and peers at other institutions that have all but thrown in the towel with international recruitment, saying, because of the situation that we're in, because of X, Y, and Z, we're not able to recruit international students. And obviously that's a perception, right? That's not the reality. There are still thousands upon thousands of international students just came into the United States at the start of this fall 2017 term at colleges all over the country. So obviously that's more of a perception than a reality. But I think it's a very easy thing to do. And we talk about this all the time in higher education, these crutches that we tend to fall on. If we hit some hard times, it's our inability to kind of evolve and change our strategy in order to, in some cases, take advantage of a situation. And I think there, as always is in almost any business, but particularly in higher ed, when it comes to things like this and the landscape in international recruitment, there are winners and there are losers, and there's very few institutions kind of floating around in the middle, just making their way. And I think it behooves the bold to really get out there and be aggressive. And I know we're going to talk about some specifics, and I want to get to that. But you touched on the survey that Terminal 4 conducts. It's titled the Global Higher Education Survey. Talk about what your goal was for this survey and what were the emerging trends that came out in this year's responses.
Yeah, so this is a survey, and it can be downloaded. I know you've tweeted it out there. It's www.terminal4.com/survey 2017. I suppose this is the fourth year we've run the survey. This year over 400 universities responded to it. And basically what we're mainly talking to the web, digital marketing, recruitment teams, anybody, I suppose it's from a digital point of view. And I suppose what we're trying to do is get an insight firstly in what are the trends, what's working for people, what's not working, simple things like, which social platforms are giving you the best return. But actually, over the last 2 years, one of the big trends that have come out of it, and then we're also interested in, well, what are the things that are actually shaping your decisions? For example, like the issue with visas and so on. But the other part of it we're seeing, and I think they're quite interconnected, is resources. We're seeing this really unusual or odd sort of reduction in resources in teams, or lack of a budget for doing digital, and where you would think actually in the current environment, you'd think it would be going the other way around. So that's been really fascinating for us. And we've got a lot of, so while we have stats in the report that everybody can download as a PDF, we've actually got some really interesting raw data behind the scenes as to that. And we've been looking at sort of like different trends and so on. But I suppose the real aim, I suppose, for us as Terminal 4, right? We love working with universities. We want to help them. We want to see, can we help them make the business case in up to senior management as to why web and digital and modern recruitment tactics are worth investing in. But I think what this is interesting, to link it back to what you were saying about, people have sometimes given up on foreign student recruitment. I think the challenge is interlinked. It needs investment, and other countries and other places are upping their investment. So it's easy to sort of roll over and say, oh, well, I can't compete, so I'm not going to do it. And it's easy then to blame, say, visas and so on. But say with the US, with a US perspective on this, the US education system in third level, higher education, is very, very well respected internationally. So I think the problem, though, I believe, is that the resources aren't being put in. Unless you're like a huge brand name university, that would be a brand name recognized all around the world. I think it's getting harder and more effort is required, because other universities in other countries are raising their game, and sometimes considerably. The Australian universities are putting so much effort into this. I would say they're probably one of the leading lights in foreign student recruitment. So the survey is really interesting because we're able to split it out by country. We're able to sort of see the trends, what are the things that are real challenges for the universities. And obviously the visa and foreign student recruitment, it was a big, big thing. But I think ultimately there's a problem with resourcing up to be able to compete. I don't know why. Maybe that's another conversation as to why does web still get sort of and digital and everything sometimes be lower down the order of priorities. But that's another conversation. We could be here for hours just talking about that topic.
Sure. As someone in charge of a budget and a marketing budget, I can tell you that it's a difficult conversation to have when we're trying to tighten the belt when it comes to anything digital. I think one of the biggest challenges is there's still this kind of old school thought pattern in higher education. And if you can't see it, then it doesn't necessarily exist. So if you're not a billboard, if you're not a television ad, if you're not a radio advertisement, then it doesn't really exist, because in the digital landscape, you're recruiting to an individual student. And obviously we're not recruiting board members or, staff and faculty on college campuses. So they're not seeing that advertising going on. So that's something that's still very much a challenge. And I'm sure it's a challenge in the international space. You did make a point that I definitely do not want to lose sight of. And we talked about it a little bit before we went on today, is this idea, and from my perspective, I think every college and university that recruits international students knows that other countries, you mentioned Australia, throughout Europe, Germany, are recruiting international students as well. And they're having some success, and probably more success than they've ever had in that realm, because of some of the issues that we've already discussed. But what I don't think US colleges and universities are willing to admit to this point is that domestic students in the US are now being recruited by colleges and universities abroad to leave the US and go abroad. Can you touch on that a little bit for me?
Yeah, and I think it's early days, right? But we're definitely seeing a trend in this, and we're seeing some marketing campaigns that I would say are very targeted, and you would not see in the US. But definitely, we're seeing foreign universities looking at the cost of tuition and the sort of the desire for students, millennials, not to be burdened with, a lot of debt, as an opportunity. And I think we're seeing universities doing campaigns, and we're seeing them. I think it's early days, but I think it's potentially something that could be massively disrupting. Like, to do a quick calculation, for example, say for a US student to come to Ireland or to the UK, and obviously you pay your foreign student tuition, which is higher than, say, for example, an Irish student studying in Ireland. And you add on accommodation, you add on cost of living, and even if you added on a flight home every month, it would still be cheaper than just your tuition in some universities in the US, right? So with that quick little calculation, what they're saying is, hey, we'll come and have an interesting experience. Obviously, if their parents let them leave and so on, but come and have a great experience, international travel, meet new people. And you know what? The cost of doing this is going to be lower than you studying in the US. And the education quality, you know, we're not talking about, you know, poor quality universities or colleges. So I think that quick calculation is very easy sell, plus the idea that you can have a really interesting international student experience and not be burdened by as much debt. So what we're definitely seeing is like that foreign universities are now looking at tactics to say, well, hang on, that's a good proposition and quite engaging proposition. Now, only early days, but it'll be interesting to see how that pans out over the next 2 to 3 years. You know, I think that's something that, you know, everybody is a foreign student, depending on what country they're being looked at from. So, you know, US students can also be foreign students into other countries as well. And, you know, I'd be curious to how that goes. You know, it's certainly an interesting and compelling marketing idea, you know. So we'll see how it goes over the next couple of years. But it's something definitely for particularly US universities to be very, at least be aware of, that that's a potential threat when they're doing their SWOT analysis. You know, it's a potential threat. But I think it's an interesting one to think about.
Absolutely. It's fascinating. I mean, again, you know, I've worked on the college campus for 15 years. We're not having those conversations. We're not worried about, you know, an institution in Scotland coming to New Jersey to, you know, go into our backyard and to take students out. But why couldn't that happen in the very near future, particularly as it gets easier to travel, as more things become remote? You know, obviously with technology improving, you can do a lot of these things over breaks, and you can visit home and still be doing work at your university. So, I mean, I think it's incredible. I think back to even my childhood, you know, where the idea of, you know, if you knew one person that went to grad school at Oxford, it was like this grand thing, and this idea that a whole different world. And now that's completely changed our perception in terms of, you know, how we would handle something like that. But again, I do not think this is on many people's radar, and I think it certainly should. So I want to transition a little bit into you know, what colleges are doing now, and you've heard it all. I mean, you've been on college campuses, you've advised colleges on what to be doing in the space. But what are you hearing? Maybe some examples of the good, the bad, and kind of the indifferent about how colleges in the U.S. are recruiting internationally.
Yeah, I don't think, you know, what I'll try and do is I'll dip into, I think, like looking at across the world, because I think, to be fair, I think the biggest challenge though is across the world, is that when universities, if they're looking, a lot of universities have an international student recruitment element of their university strategy. I think I'm seeing, and you know what, it's great actually in some cases where universities say, actually, we don't have that part of our strategy. I think where the issue is where they say international student recruitment is part of our strategy, but that's where it ends. You know, there's no, they haven't got into the nuances of, you know, well, what type of student are we trying to attract, from what country, you know. So it's not, and we often see it, we see it in the UK, for example. A lot of universities there have an international student recruitment strategy, but it's actually the same. And many of them publish their strategic plans online. And I always think about this, that you could actually download a lot of their strategic plans, cut off their logo, and you wouldn't actually know who they are, that they have the same, we need to recruit foreign students. So what I would say is if genuinely international student recruitment is a core part of your strategy, you have to get into your detail of exactly who you're targeting. It can't just be everybody. Like, we've heard things of, well, we target Asian students. You know, Asia's a pretty big place, you know, and the nuances, if you say look at places like Singapore to you know, to Malaysia, even like Singapore, Malaysia, without being a geography, to know your world maps really well. Like, you know, Singapore is a little part of hanging on the bottom of Malaysia. Of course, that's not politically correct description of the geography, but basically they're borders. But like, you know, they're very different markets, you know, like Singapore is very wealthy. You know, you'd see a lot of students from Singapore, people going there to study, you know, international business. Business schools like IMD from Switzerland have a campus there. We see medical students traveling there, and they're fairly wealthy, so they travel around the world. Malaysia would be very different, Philippines would be very different. So I think the first number one thing is, if it's part of your strategy, it genuinely has to be part of your strategy, and you have to get into the detail. So we've seen people do this properly by maybe partnering with the university in a particular area and delivering programs in a particular location, whether it's the Middle East or parts of China and so on. But I think you have to understand the nuances of each individual market and ultimately know who you want to hire. So we do some work with a medical school, and I think it's a good way of thinking about it. The medical school have students from the US, Malaysia, and the Middle East. And they have a different strategy for each type of student, because each student is interested in very, very different things, even though they could be doing the same degree or graduate program. And they do very clever things like content targeting. So when people from Malaysia visit their website, they see different content, different imagery, different messages than the same type of person from the Middle East. So I think that's number one. If it's genuinely part of your strategy, you have to have figured out exactly the focus, because there's too many universities out there at the moment saying foreign students, international students, and that's it, So we see, I'll tell you, the people who do it very well are some of the Australian universities. Really focus in on targeting, for example, like, we're going to focus on this part of Vietnam, do campaigns there. We do some work with Southern Cross University near Brisbane, Australia. Like, one of their campuses literally has the airport a short walk from where their campus is. Like, I visited them and you walked across the road to the airport. And they were telling me was that has been fantastic for them, because they almost have people flying in from China to study there, and it's just convenience. They can fly in, study, and they can get home easily if they need to for a short break and so on. So that's the number one thing. If it's in your strategy, it has to be properly in your strategy. It can't just be a vague bullet point that everybody talks about, where there's no tactics and there's no detail behind it.
Yeah, so I think those are all good points, and I would love to get into a little bit more of the specifics of that. And so, and in your survey, you touch on a couple of things, and in our talk before this, you certainly touched on some really interesting things. So if you don't mind, I want to throw a couple ideas at you, and just let the listeners know kind of where do you think it fits in recruitment in the international market. And the one that I love talking to you about was the multilingual websites. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. Every time, because I'm on a couple of mailing lists, I'm sure you are, for web and marketing and recruitment around the world. And the big question comes out is like, who's using Google Translate for their website? If you're using, never, ever, ever, there's no way I can even sugarcoat this. Never, ever use Google Translate. Nobody wants to translate something. They can right click in their browser and just go translate this page. But the translation can be so poor. It just reflects so poorly on your university, and also shows that you're not serious about a particular market. So what I would say is the best way to do it is either through content targeting or a microsite focused on a particular region, is get it properly translated through an agency with your content management system. You can, depending on what it is, maybe it's Terminal4, maybe not, but you can link it into a translation workflow and so on. But you need to have it properly translated. And that's even things like, for example, if you're targeting Brazil, that's a very different, they speak Spanish. The Spanish in Mexico can be different in subtle ways to the Spanish in Spain. So it's having very focused microsites, and that are not huge, because there's a translation effort and a cost involved with that, but that they're just good quality, because people are judging your university. And people, it's interesting when you talk to students, they say, look, the quality of a website has a direct reflection on their perception of the quality of education in the university, right? We know that that is not a real thing, but if they have that perception, you need to put the effort in. So when I say microsites properly translated, sometimes the argument is said, well, but hang on, we need people to be able to speak English for them to come to our university. We're not going to be delivering lectures in their native language. But a key component are the parents. The parents, this is probably another secondary point, that just because you know parents, say in the US, the parents and their needs in another country are often have very different thoughts and needs than, say, a parent in the local environment. So it comes back to the strategy. It's about saying we're targeting this country and really looking at the nuances and having a very, very distinct message that's very clear for that particular market, and then understanding the parents. You know, it's interesting. We see, we know one university that's really targets their content. So, for example, one of a generalization, but it is, we see it true, is that, for example, certain Chinese students like what they call Harry Potter buildings, right? So it's having, I know that sounds a real generalization, but it's actually true. They get better conversion and better application levels when they use, on, say, microsites, imagery of sort of old style buildings. So what I would say is it's making sure you build these microsites for each individual market. The great thing is, though, is you can use modern digital marketing techniques. So with a lot of our clients at the moment, a hot topic is doing content targeting. So, for example, on the homepage of the university, it knows the person is coming from a particular place. It uses imagery that maybe has a stronger connection with them. And then it links off to a microsite where they can find out more. So I think putting the effort into translation, putting the effort into the content before it's translated. There's no point just taking the same microsite and go, well, can you translate that into 50 languages? Every country will have their own needs and their own things that will connect with what they're interested in. So you need to almost copyright based on each individual market. So because that takes effort, right, then you have to pick what are really the markets you want to target. You know, and maybe it's not about targeting 30 countries. Maybe it's about targeting 2 or 3 or 4 really, really well and doing it properly with the proper translation, the proper microsites and proper content targeting. But I would say never, ever, ever use Google Translate. You know, it just, I think, just reflects really poorly on any university from like there's great stories. You can Google them, of stories where I think there was some Italian government website decided to use Google Translate to translate. I think it was Silvio Berlusconi, the Prime Minister of Italy's, his profile, his biography on his website. And I think I remember was he went to the University of Bologna, but I think it translated into something to do with pasta and bolognese sauce, and it's just like that was sort of ridiculed internationally. Like, you do not want that sort of stuff to happen. And the problem is you don't know it because you might know that language. So you don't know that it's poor quality, but it can be great, Google Translate, but it's not for when you're trying to connect with people who are looking to make a 4-year investment, and substantial amount of money for an education. So yeah, that's my little rant there. Sorry about that, Adam.
I totally get it. I mean, I have a new appreciation for it now. And you touched on it before, but these things take resources. I mean, you talked about a microsite. You talked about partnering with a firm that knows the area. You talked about content marketing, which can be very expensive. So I think people need to understand that if you're going to do this right, and you hit the nail on the head. I mean, you're talking about 2 to 3 countries. You're not talking about this grand international scheme where you're recruiting international students en masse. So I think that's really important, because if you're going to do it right, there's going to be certainly some financial resources having to be put into a project like this. But obviously, you can get much better results if you are able to focus in on the key things that people are actually looking for. And that was hysterical about the Harry Potter buildings. It's certainly something you would not think of, but I mean, it makes sense that people, from different areas of the world are going to be attracted to different type of architecture and things like that. So it was really interesting.
Yeah, it is. And I think so when you pick, so say you pick a couple of countries you're going to target and target well, if you're not familiar, people who are listening to the podcast aren't familiar with international student recruitment. The model can be different in other countries. So some countries, for example, people go and select a university or college through an agent. So the agent does a lot of the sort of the on the ground, trying to find the right sort of place for the student. So I think there's lots of potential, but as you said there, Adam, it has to have budget, it has to have resources. If it doesn't have it, don't bother, because, I think we're seeing other universities in many countries, and not everywhere, but the countries the universities who are doing it well are putting budget into it and seeing results. So I think there's a good business case to be made, but I think it's definitely picking the countries that are a good fit for maybe the ethos and the subject areas and the reputation of your university, and find out what's a good fit. I think, but then what you can do is, I mean, you're right. It's a large amount of effort, and you do need to get sort of on the ground. I mean, you don't need to do a big research project, but I think even having somebody on the ground there, like for example, we work on projects in the Middle East, and very quickly people tell you like what type of imagery people like to use. Certain colors are not good colors to use in China. And so on. Another thing that I think is a quick win, just to run through a few practical things, is people don't realize sometimes how slow their websites can be when you're visiting from a foreign country. I remember I think I was in Ireland at the time, and I visited a university's website in Australia. It's about as far away as you can get geographically. And it's slow, but we know, and maybe people don't, but there's direct correlation between online conversion and engagement with the speed of the website, even down to milliseconds. And Google has a ton of resources on this. So people feel, our website's cool and it's great. But there's two things. One, for example, if you're targeting a country where broadband and internet access mightn't be that great. Right? So then maybe that big, huge video that you're doing that's being delivered from, say, California, you're targeting the Middle East. You need to think about the lag time, because the people will give up quicker. But things like that are easy to solve. We're doing things like what are called content delivery networks. You're bringing the content closer to the place. But that's something to be aware of. Another challenge you can have, particularly if you're targeting China, is your IP address can sometimes be blacklisted by the Great Firewall, and so on. So that's stuff you need to be aware of, that your website mightn't actually be very accessible from China. So there's a couple of options around that. But that's some practical stuff that you wouldn't even think of, that you can be doing all this good work and you realize that your IP address was used or blacklisted ages ago for some weird reason, maybe because an academic said something bad about China, and that nobody can really visit your website. So stuff like that could be a big issue as well.
No, it's amazing. That's a great takeaway. Absolutely. I don't think people are really thinking about that. You mentioned agents before. So let's talk a little bit about agents and their role. Anytime I have, experts on from the international space, I love to talk about this, because there's so much conflicting opinion about the role of agents. And I think it changes as time and political landscape changes as well. So tell us a little bit about where you think the role of agents are right now in this field.
I think it's an area ripe for disruption. I think, and it's only very particular countries. Like, I think a lot of countries a lot of sort of, say, English-speaking countries, agents don't really exist. I think in certain countries, like China and so on, I think maybe they're like a trusted person that they can sort of navigate the landscape. I mean, we know how many higher education institutions there are in the US, and the same, there's a good number in many other countries. So I think in some cases it's helping them navigate the landscape. I think my personal perception is that it's sometimes the parents needing a bit of advice and guidance around this. Look, I think they're really important in certain countries, but I think maybe over time, when we're having this conversation in 10 years' time, maybe not, because people are doing, as we're all seeing, people are doing their own research. I think what we're seeing works very well from a recruitment point of view is that, the type of, you know, so road shows of universities, whatever way you call them, like little mini exhibitions of universities. I think people are finding them really helpful because they can get to meet people, and we're seeing universities and sending people over to do road shows or having some local people to do that. So I think the agents are not to be, I think you're also marketing to the agents. I don't know, I think it's ripe for disruption, right? Because it just seems like it's the real definition of a middleman, and everything else online and in modern, it's getting rid of the middleman. But it is important, it is important. Your market at this current point in time, you're marketing to the agents as much as you're marketing to the students, as you're marketing to the parents.
Right. You can almost see, at some point, an institution that's, really ingrained in international recruitment. And if we're narrowing it down to 2 or 3 countries, what's to have them say they don't have a native from that country working for them, doing you're taking out the translation, you're taking out issue of any cultural or cultural differences that may be an issue, or the ability to express, what it's like to be, on a particular campus. So I think you're absolutely right. I think that's certainly something that could be disrupted in the very near future, as there'll be soon, obviously I don't speak Chinese or Mandarin, but if there's a great translator that can do it on demand through a video chat like this, then it breaks down so many different silos when you're speaking to students. So I think that's incredibly interesting. But I want to touch on, I don't want to forget the idea of kind of digital advertising, and I know that's one of your areas of expertise. So, and it can be very tricky overseas. And you mentioned China before. You can't get much through in terms of certainly social media, but other digital strategies. So what do you see working out there? I know things like IP targeting, geofencing are becoming really largely adopted in the US, but really for domestic recruitment. So what's happening in the international space?
Yeah, no, we're seeing that that's your number one. From a digital marketing point of view, that is probably one of your best tactics, because then you can just all out have a very distinct message for a distinct audience. You're not trying to have your homepage with, half talking to staff, half talking to graduate programs, half talking to undergraduate, half talking to, your financial aid calculator, which of course wouldn't need to ever be mentioned when you're talking to somebody internationally. So I think that's your number one tactic, is to implement, and that's, I have to say, for the projects that we have on the go at the moment, I'd say almost all of them are doing smart stuff in that area. I think that's absolutely key. What we're doing for people is actually then hosting some of the websites closer to those areas. Having, say, an Asian version, or at least anyone from the large Asia space, be delivered from a server closer. We're also seeing people getting the web teams and the digital marketing teams getting much more competent with the social networks that are the key social networks in those countries. As we know, in China, it's a very different set of social networks. So then you're thinking, well, how can I use those, and how can I do So we're seeing web teams, and this is where it comes back to resources. You can't be taking on another channel, and we're seeing people certainly in the US, focusing in on Instagram, focusing in on Facebook. Certainly from our survey results, there was a really interesting, Snapchat a little bit, but really focusing on those. But when you say talking China, you're talking about a whole different ball game. And you need a team of people if you're going to do some sort of marketing there. You need people who can talk the language. Otherwise, even, setting up an account and stuff like that's going to be very tricky. You'll be out of your depth very quickly. So I think that then comes back to resources, because, you cannot take on another social media channel without having people who know how to use it and get the most out of it. Some other tactics that work well is, I think email is a bit tricky. I think we're also seeing this in the US as well. Is like, I think someone tweeted at the AMA Higher Education Conference about, everybody is sending their child or their teenager emails, and he doesn't actually open his emails, and I think the same is happening in other areas. So I think it's looking at email, I think could be great because it's obviously low cost, but again, you need to personalize the message and also understand that actually email also in some countries plays even a lower part of people's daily lives than say in the US and the UK and so on.
So I always think about this, and I think about it, from my institution, is we don't have many international students, and we're not doing many of the things that you're saying. Particularly, we're a small private institution, don't have a lot of resources, and it would take a just significant amount of resources to launch a program like this. And there's other reasons, of course, but I'm always interested to know your thoughts and my guest thoughts on the idea that, if I'm a institution, be it public, private, small, large, and I'm not currently in the international space, but I now have a strategic plan that calls for an increased international student enrollment, which many do, but very few schools are kind of getting it right. Is there still space in this market for kind of a new school to jump into it? And if there is, how does one go about doing that?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, right? But I think this is really interesting from the point of view of when you're doing your strategic planning, right? I think one of the best ways, unless you're a big brand, a big name that it would be known overseas, I think it's going to be tricky, right? And it's also a very big risk because to do it properly, the investment, you need to put the investment in. What we are seeing working quite well, and there's some good examples of this, of where, say, for example, you start dipping your toe in the water, like you maybe partner. So say, Adam, for strategy for you, here's some free ideas, right? You can go and talk to the management now in the next few minutes and get a crazy budget to do this stuff. But we see things like summer programs, or maybe having a partnership with an international university, or at least a facility where you could teach internationally and use that as a way to dip your toe in the local market. So we've seen, for example, universities, say from Australia, set up, link up with, say, places in the Middle East, or in RMIT have a location in Barcelona because they have a big architectural school. RMIT is a university in Melbourne, Australia. One that's really an interesting one, I think, is Sacred Heart University in Connecticut. They actually, one of our clients, we've worked with them for many years, and I couldn't believe it when I first visited there. In the reception area, they had a huge poster about a small, I'll say campus, but let's say an experience that they offer to their students to study in Kerry, which is the southwest of Ireland, absolutely one of those beautiful places in Ireland. And that's now grown and grown. What they've now done is I think they've actually bought their own facility there to teach. And what they're doing is there's like study abroad and so on. So what they're doing is they're dipping their toe in the market that way. Because Sacred Heart wouldn't be a huge international brand at all, but they're actually dipping their toe in, and that's been going very successfully for them. And it raises their exposure both for international students, but also it helps their local students experience things internationally and gets them a good feel for local market. And then things could grow from there. So we've seen quite a few universities in England are doing partnerships with other universities or colleges in other countries, and doing sort of using that as a way to understand the nuances before they do any commitment of, well, like we're going to try and recruit 4-year students to come and travel here, using that to understand the local market and the nuances, and also seeing, it's at least fail, but fail small. Don't take down the whole university by diverting your budget to, trying to, hire to recruit all your students from Kazakhstan next year. Try and dip your toe in the water. I think so. I think online is another good strategy, although that's getting busy. And I think that the challenge there, though, is when you look at the online tuition versus, so that's where there's a very level playing field. But the challenge is there's huge cost differences between different countries. So a UK university doing online programs, could be very different to an Australian. And ultimately, all you need is internet access. So that's something that people can use to dip their toe in the water. Or what we see is online programs where they do a certain amount on site in a physical location in a country internationally. I think there is scope. I would definitely think there is scope. I think you just need to be smart. You need to know the little niche that's going to work for you guys. If you said, well, we're going to target Asia and we're going to try and get every degree program or major that we're doing, we're going to, so no, that would just be a waste of time.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's a good idea. We always hear those stories, right? We have there's another college up the street from me, only about 5 miles away, that they had this influx of students from Tibet, and the vice president for enrollment over there was like, "Where are these students coming from?" Nobody had a clue. They weren't, they didn't have any feet on the ground. They weren't doing any type of marketing or any type of special initiatives for those groups. And it was a group of 3 recent alums that were there teaching English. And we're just referring students back, and they just got this pipeline going. So I mean, it could be, these minor things can often turn into, these very nice blips in terms of international. But if you want a sustained presence, obviously you're going to need to be much bigger and planned out.
I think you've made a really interesting point there, though, as well. Is Tibet is such an interesting. That whole idea of Tibet, as opposed, we see a lot of, say, for example, UK universities say we target India, we target China. There are lots of countries around where there'd be less competition, but maybe you could get into. So maybe, for example, like, you could try and recruit, say, Thai students or Laos, or smaller countries that are probably less on the radar. But of course you have to have a connection there, and them having sort of 3 people on the ground. I mean, they're probably your best salespeople ever. They're the best representation of the university. I mean, I think that's a bit of luck, right? But maybe they can then start. They can build from that. But I think there is opportunities, I think, to start small and try and find a niche that could work.
Yeah, and sometimes you need that luck, that little nudge that points you in that direction. So this hour absolutely flew by, but I couldn't end this episode without asking you. Such an interesting guy, such an interesting background. So what's next for you, Piero? I mean, what's on your radar? What do you hope to accomplish in the near future?
Yeah, I think it's really exciting right now, because I think we're seeing. I suppose 2 things we're trying to help is a lot of universities get their web governance and their structures in place so they can do more of this sort of stuff. But I think it's so exciting right now. Is, for me personally, I get such a great buzz out of there's so many interesting techniques, like recently, obviously, we mentioned about personalization, but there's so much interesting things like around data and using data to help decision making. There's so much really cool stuff happening outside higher ed. We're really excited about helping people to use that in higher ed. So yeah, no, for us, like, we're, to be honest, we're super busy helping people, and it's great. Like, we had some great results. We had one client in Massachusetts. We managed to increase their conversion yield by 300%. And when you get results like that, that's pretty amazing. But that's an edge case usually. But you can definitely, there's lots of improvements to be made. And every time we can show, and this is where collecting data is so important, and using data is so important, that every time we see an uplift, that's what gets us really excited and gets me excited. And yeah, it's interesting. I mean, what I love doing is actually then is also seeing what people are doing in different countries, because everybody, I'd say, is doing certain things well. And if you can help spread that knowledge around, that's really exciting for me. And we cover a blog as well where we talk about examples of what people are doing. And certainly if people ever have tips or ideas of things they'd like to sort of show off, always let us know. We're always interested in tips and opportunities to show off people's good work.
Awesome. Piero Tintori, everybody, thank you so much for coming on. Tell people how they can find you online.
Yeah, sure. So if people want the survey that we mentioned today, that's www.terminal4, all spelled out, .com/survey 2017. I'm also on Twitter, Piero Tintori. Hopefully that this, you just type it as you spell it. I don't think there's any other Piero Tintoris in the world. But both Twitter and sort of through our blog, they would be the key places that I'd be sharing things, and both the Terminal 4 Twitter feed and my own personal one. And if anyone wants to reach out, connect with me on Twitter, ask any questions afterwards, or have a call and we can chat ideas. I'm always happy to chat and learn what people are doing, and if I can share experiences from other places, very happy to do that. And Adam, thank you so much for the opportunity to talk with you today.
It's a real pleasure. I think we definitely learned a lot today, so I appreciate you coming on. I do want to thank, as always, M. Stoner, our sponsor. They certainly make Higher Ed Live, and particularly Admissions Live, go. A big thank you goes out to our program sponsor, NRCCUA, as well. Piero, have a great day. Thank you for joining us again. And everybody, tune in next month for another edition of Admissions Live. Take care.